Right. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning in South Africa. Like Dylan mentioned, I'm sitting in Johannesburg, where it's 23 degrees Celsius, what we call cold. And I'm really excited to be part of Div Around the Sun and be joining everybody here from the comfort of my dining room, nicely in isolation. So, just to give a bit of context, my name is Nyari, and I'm the CEO of an organization called We Think Code that's based out of Johannesburg and Cape Town in South Africa that trains young people to essentially to code over a period of about 2 years. We run a tuition-free program. And when I was asked to speak Dev Around the Sun, I thought it would be great for me to give some context on the work we're doing and share what the challenges are in our very particular context in making participating in technology accessible to young people. So if we could go over to my slides now, and if I can also just click on here and figure out where they are. Great. Okay. So democratizing technology education. Let me start with a quote that I find quite inspirational within the context, which is, education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it. And I think what this particular crisis has done, it has thrust tomorrow upon us very, very quickly. And we've been forced to look at the situation and say, are we ready for tomorrow? And what are we doing to be more prepared? And in the context of the work that I do, technology literacy, technology contribution is a critical part of what is starting to shape the world. And the work we're doing at We Think Code is largely focused on driving inclusion. So to give everybody context on a little bit of the statistics of South Africa, so you can understand a lot of maybe what are embedded assumptions in the things I say, I just thought I'd put this slide up that gives you some context. So of all 100 people that start education in South Africa, in a school, in a primary school, I think that's elementary school is what they say in the US, is of the 100 that start, 60 will actually write matric, which is the equivalent of the high school graduating standardized testing. 37 will pass that test, 12 will go to university, and 6 will actually leave university with an undergraduate qualification. And I'll just let that context sink in for a bit, which means 6 in every 100 end up with an undergraduate qualification, and 37 in every 100 actually end up with a high school qualification in education. And so faced with this context, in a country where the national unemployment level is 29%, when you look at it for youth, it probably goes up to about 40%. What we were looking at is a situation where across the board, inclusion in the economy is not going so well. Upward mobility is not so great. So if you start in an economic context that's underprivileged, the chances that you would end up firstly with just a high school qualification, secondly, that with a graduate degree, and then subsequent to that with a professional career is very slim. And We Think Code is looking at the situation and saying, well, how do we bridge the gap in the tech space specifically, where the demand for the skills is high and it's there, but the unemployment is structural, the skills aren't available. And Africa generally, South Africa definitely, outsources large parts of its creation of technical content to the rest of the world. And so we saw an opportunity and said, well, is 6 out of 100 truly a reflection of what aptitude is available out there? Is 37 out of 100 truly a reflection of the competence that's out there, the aptitude that's out there? And when you think of technology, it's not like we take all 6, we probably take a sliver of the 6, a sliver of the 37. And the view was that definitely not. And if we've got all this opportunity in tech, if tech is shaping our world, and less than 6, less than 37 of our people are in a seat at the table that shapes it, we've got a problem. So there's an opportunity here to close the gap of inclusion by bringing capability. But with that come some problems. And so we set out on a mission that essentially says that if we all agree that 6 out of 100 is not the true reflection of the aptitude and capability that exists in our country, then truly recruiting for aptitude should increase the diversity in the software community. Our software community is predominantly, like everywhere else in the world, white male. And not just white male, socioeconomically, is people who are coming from middle class and up. And in South Africa, we've got a high Gini coefficient, which means that there's the highest inequality in the world between the most wealthy and the most poor. So if we get our recruiting right and we recruit for aptitude, not your background, not where you went to school, not how much money your parents had, not any of these things that are not reflective of your own capability, then this diversity issue we're seeing in the software community should resolve. And the next view is that if we're delivering comprehensive foundational training to this group that we identify as having the aptitude, what we should have is a group of well-equipped developers who are able to autonomously evolve as the technology world changes, right? So aptitude means more people that are diverse. Comprehensive training means that diverse group of people is highly competent. And then if we're successful in building pathways to impactful participation, then what we should see is improved economic position for the individual developer and the delivery of relevant solutions for the people that consume them. And this is just to say, when you look at the context that we live in, whether it's access to data or the cost of data, the kinds of cell phones that we use in mobile technology, contexts shift from place to place. And so if we're building mobile solutions within Africa, we need to build mobile solutions that are relevant to our context, that are relevant to possibly not having great access to good bandwidth, that are relevant to contexts where maybe electricity comes and goes, that are relevant to devices that are not necessarily the most modern smartphone. And so all of this context matters in who we're recruiting, what we're training them to do, and where we are pathwaying them to participate in the tech economy. And so that's the mission of We Think Code, is essentially to succeed at these things through very particular interventions. And so let's go back to this issue of aptitude when recruiting, right? So when we talk about aptitude and recruiting and training for competence, the next thing that comes to mind is, well, who is the person who has aptitude? And this is a highly controversial question within the world of tech. A lot of very different perspectives exist around who is the person who has capability. But the way we see it is that there are probably three particular building blocks on the individual, and they're building blocks that relate to the institutions that capacitate the individual. And then all of this has an impact on what happens within the society. So if I start with the issue of cognitive ability, this generally speaks to inherently what you have, your learning capacity, your ability to acquire knowledge, how well you remember the knowledge you acquire, your analytical skills. When information is presented in front of you, how are you able to interrogate it and use it? And so that's inherent in the individual. The next issue is your prior knowledge, which is before you arrived, whether it's at We Think Code or any learning institution, what capabilities did you have within you, right? What's your ability to learn, which is more generic? So whether it's me taking up gardening last year when I was going a bit stir crazy, or it's learning to code for someone like myself, again, who transferred careers from accounting into technology, what things have you done that have taught you to learn? And then there's transferable knowledge. These are patterns of learning that in the context of tech might not be directly relevant, but the skills you gain are helpful. In interviewing some of the students at We Think Code, I remember realizing that, for example, people who were athletes, people that had spent time in the military, the discipline they learned in that was actually transferable in the discipline of working repetitively with the terminal that's screaming at you when the computer won't do what you told it to. Right? And so what are your patterns of working with logic, for example? Wherever you learned it, it will be relevant and transferable. And then there's the knowledge that you have previous to the moment you start to learn technology, which is directly relevant. For example, exposure to programming. And so going back to that question of aptitude, what we find is that for people in South Africa, especially, that are coming from a socioeconomic background that's highly disadvantaged, or people who come from an advantaged background but weren't exposed to tech, very common with a lot of young women, this bottom layer of building blocks is not necessarily strongly represented in the people that graduate out of computer science programs, because those programs don't include them. When they test for aptitude on these people, they don't have a lot of directly relevant prior knowledge. And while they may have transferable knowledge, the skills that test for entry, the tests used for entry don't check for those things. So the transferable knowledge isn't identified. And then their generic kind of learning how to learn can be inhibited by the early childhood training that they got. And so consequently, aptitude when measured across this path has historically excluded a lot of people who have a lot to contribute. And so within the We Think Code context, we've gone here and said, oh, there's an interesting way we could actually do this, where we introduce testing using online games. And what the online games do is they test for your logic without necessarily saying, can you use the logic as a software developer straight away? They look at how do you play with patterns and how do you follow those? And so we're able to identify aptitude that's transferable knowledge without necessarily insisting on the direct knowledge itself. The next thing we do is we bring people that pass those first round of testing and we take them into a face-to-face selection boot camp. And over a period of about 3.5 weeks, they're taught new concepts of coding and have to do projects to apply. And what we're able to learn there is how quickly do you acquire these new things and apply them? So we start to test that kind of learning to learn ability in an individual. And we start to see that, okay, given some exposure to programming concepts, how quickly can a person apply them? And so what we're able to identify as aptitude are things that traditional pathways of training would otherwise exclude. But then now there's the next layer of it, which is, so what does the learning institution do? It's one thing to say, I'm going to build a big tent. Everybody gets to come in. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic background is. It doesn't matter if you coded before. But then now we take on a responsibility. We now have people in our ranks that don't necessarily have the day one skills that another traditional learning institution would require. And what this does is it puts pressure on the person's psychosocial state. So their self-esteem, the ability to build social relationships, which in this context are necessary for learning, and the ability to build resilience, like that perseverance. I try and I fail and I try and I fail. And anyone who can code is going to tell you that being comfortable with that kind of loop of trial and error, without being comfortable with that, success is actually very difficult to achieve. And so there's a psychosocial support layer. And when we now say we're taking a school and taking individuals that are coming from, a certain base level of cognitive ability, prior knowledge that's not necessarily directly relevant to tech, but can be transferred across, and a varying level of psychosocial backgrounds that are pressurized by the lack of confidence, the lack of self-esteem, the lack of prior exposure, being put into environments with social networks that are not your own. How does the school play a part in taking that individual and actually equipping them to be able to be successful as a developer? And this is important because it's this context of, if you buy the responsibility of equipping an individual who has certain gaps, the pedagogy that you apply needs to be able to take them from where they are to where we want them to get to, right? And so we've obviously made a very opinionated decision on who to teach because we're driving inclusion. And with that, we've adopted a responsibility of what we want to teach you. We want to teach you the foundational aspects. And so those foundational aspects require you to get to a certain level of learning. And so there's this model known as the learning edge methodology. And what it is about is essentially that we all learn at the edge of our knowledge. And so that's to say, if you knew it already, when you tell it to me, I'm not learning. But if I didn't know it already, and then you start to tell it to me, I'll learn. But the issue is that if where you start to teach me is too far removed from where I started, then the learning is overwhelming. And my failure is not a reflection of my cognitive ability, but is rather a reflection of the extent of the cognitive leap that you require me to make. So let me think of it as a simple example. You've never driven a car before. In fact, you've never ridden in a car before. And I put you in the vehicle and I give you a set of car keys and I say, go. Do you know how to turn it on? Do you know how to reverse? Do you know what the pedals are? There's all these dials in front of you, odometer, etc. Do you know what they mean? The leap is too big. But if you've been driven in a vehicle before and someone sits next to you and says, okay, we're going to be driving and we're going to be moving forward, there's an existing knowledge you have about how a vehicle moves. And then if someone starts to explain to you and say, here are the pedals, there's the key, there's the accelerator, there's the brake pedal, you're able to access that and understand that in a certain way. And so pedagogy is important in this regard, which is if you drive inclusion, you accept as a governing constraint the fact that the person you're working with might not have certain prior knowledge. And so we put them in an environment where through structure and incremental exposure to increasing complexity, we can actually bridge the gap between not having any prior coding background to having sound foundational coding ability that allows you to contribute on a team. And being in a peer-to-peer learning environment means that as you struggle along it, you actually start to be able to rely on another person's learning patterns to help you fill in your gaps. And so what we're essentially saying is that to drive diversity, the key thing is we've got to take aptitude and say, aptitude isn't what you know today, it's what you're able to know given a set of circumstances that expose you. And then we're saying as a school, we take responsibility for creating a set of circumstances that is structured and systematic, meets you where you are, and takes you to where you need to go. And so if you look at this as a learning, as a normal distribution, currently we've got those that are excelling and that are participating in technology, in delivering technical solutions, and that's on the far right-hand side. And with these individuals, what we're finding, at least within our context, is that it's incredibly one-dimensional. It's one-dimensional in gender, it's one-dimensional in race, and it's largely one-dimensional in terms of socioeconomic background. Then we've got maybe on the far left side where possibly the cognitive ability is just not there or is not attuned to technology. Possibly the prior knowledge gap is too big and we need some earlier childhood intervention to address that. Possibly the psychosocial situation is too adverse to bridge. But between these two extremes, there's a missing middle of people with aptitude and the ability to contribute that we're leaving out. And through the right pedagogy, we're able to start to shade that part in and bring more people in and drive the involvement and inclusion to the level that we're looking for. And so we're trying to create a virtuous cycle where if we start where we were and said the South African context, there's 6 that are graduating out of universities. So there's like 94 in every 100 that are sitting in those bottom 3 blocks. And we don't have training methodologies that include them and train them up to participate economically. And so they are caught in a vicious cycle of poverty, of lack of professional training, of lack of economic participation. And it's a rather devastating thing that pulls the entire economy down, that pulls the individual's well-being down. But by finding different ways to assess competence, different ways to assess potential, different ways to assess aptitude, we're actually able to get cohorts of people that are representative of broader parts of society, bring them together and say, okay, let's come together and become part of this technical economy. Having done this, we are going to come and put pedagogies in place that meet you where you are to take you to where you need to be in order to participate. And if we're able to do that, we create an environment where you become upwardly mobile and the individual in the short term becomes participant in an area where they otherwise would have been included, which is being a software developer. Not only are they participant, they now have control and ability to drive their own learning and get to a position where their children and the people who they look after are able to rise up. And as they do that, we start to see that bottom layer of cognitive ability, prior knowledge, and psychosocial starting points lift up so that in time, we're trying to create the redundancy of our own pedagogy as the bottom lifts. And as that bottom lifts, where maybe in the next 3 to 5 years, you start to see an increased diversity in the people that are participating in software development. In the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, you start to see higher quality of technology coming out of Africa. And we stop being largely, can I say, passive consumers of the tech and become instead active contributors to that environment. And that's what we're looking for. And so what has We Think Code achieved so far? We were founded in 2016. We've graduated 2 cohorts, and 98% of our graduates are in full-time employment. And so that's powerful. About 30% of the students that are in our cohorts are coming from families living below the poverty line. So this is people who would have been stuck largely in a cycle where they don't have access to the economy because we don't have learning pathways that enable us to unlock their capability, unlock their potential, and bring them to be powerful contributors in the economy. But it goes further. We're creating new recruiting pathways for employers because we now have about 50 corporate partners where we started with under 10, and more they're coming back for We Think Code graduates because they're seeing the quality of the output. They're seeing the power of diverse teams in their projects, and they're seeing how societally we're moving this thing forward. And so I hope that interests you, and I hope that piques your interest and get you thinking. But more so, maybe to drive it home, the question is, how does this affect the people that might be watching this and are like, okay, I'm not sitting in South Africa. That chart you had in the beginning is not necessarily relevant to my context. I think what it is understand your context, though, and see where you're responsible for the learning of others, where you're responsible for the building of teams, where you're responsible for the contribution to technical outcomes. What are the building blocks that are defining who comes into your teams? What are the building blocks that are defining how those people learn? And what are the building blocks that define the value chain for your creation? Be deliberate. Take the time to understand that lack of diversity isn't just accidental. It isn't just people playing women cards and black cards and they left me out card and poverty card. It's actually structural change, structural things that exclude people. And while you might not be the individual that created the structural barrier, your inaction is ensuring that it excludes people. And so by being a lot more conscious about these varying contexts and being a lot more deliberate about how to break down the structural limitations, you're able to play the long game and create pathways that sustainably create better outcomes of inclusion in technology. And so I think my 25 minutes is almost up, and I managed to condense what is 4 years of learning and many, many people of participating in what sometimes feels like a social experiment, but definitely, as the numbers show, is an impactful intervention. I hope this is relevant. I hope it drives some interest for you. You can go to wethinkcode.coza to get a bit more insights into the work that we do and some case studies into some of the students that we've worked with. But more importantly, I hope this has just opened up the minds of people that are working in tech to realize that all these diversity problems that we're talking about are largely solvable if we start to do things a little bit differently from the ways that we've done them in the past. And so thank you to Dev Around the Sun for the platform, and thank you to everybody who tuned in and who was listening. I hope this has been very valuable to you. Thank you.